What would you do if the people who were supposed to love and protect you turned their backs when you needed them most? This is the story of Grace Miller, a young girl cast out of her family after an unexpected pregnancy. Left to face a cold, unforgiving world on her own, Grace found herself lost and broken, carrying not just the weight of rejection, but the responsibility of a new life growing within her. But when all seemed hopeless, a kind-hearted stranger offered her a second chance, a chance to rebuild her life, to find strength she never knew she had, and to prove to herself and the world that she was so much more than the whispers and judgment that followed her. Yet even as she began to carve out a new path, Grace's past refused to stay buried. Old wounds reopened when a face from her past reappeared, begging for forgiveness. Could Grace find it in her heart to let go of the pain and anger she'd carried for so long? And would the bonds she formed along the way be enough to see her through the toughest challenges yet? Join us as we follow Grace's journey, a story of resilience, forgiveness, and hope that will remind us all of the strength within us to overcome even the darkest days. The rain came down in torrents, turning the narrow streets of Havenbrook into a river of shadows and cold. Grace Miller, only 13 years old, stood trembling on her family's porch. Her father, Matthew, loomed over her like a storm, his voice cold and unwavering. "You have shamed this family, Grace. You cannot stay here anymore," he said, his words cutting through her like the icy wind whipping around them. Grace clutched her small bag tightly, her fingers trembling as she fought back tears. "But I have nowhere to go. Please, Dad, I am sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the drumming of the rain. Matthew's face was like stone, his eyes devoid of the warmth she used to see when he tucked her in at night. Her mother, Evelyn, stood behind him, her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line. "It is for the best," Evelyn said coldly. "This mistake cannot define our lives." Grace looked between them, hoping for even the faintest sign of mercy, but none came. Slowly, she stepped off the porch, the rain soaking through her thin coat almost immediately. Her father's voice echoed behind her, a final dismissal that broke the last fragile thread of her heart. "Do not come back, Grace." She stumbled into the night, her vision blurred by tears. The streets of Havenbrook were eerily quiet, except for the relentless rain. Houses with warm light spilling from their windows seemed to mock her as she passed, their occupants safe and secure inside. Grace knocked on a neighbor's door, a couple she had known since she was a child. When the door opened, the expression on Mrs. Price's face was one of pity mixed with discomfort. "I am sorry, Grace. We cannot get involved," Mrs. Price said, closing the door gently but firmly. By the time Grace reached the town square, she was soaked to the bone. Her shoes squelched with each step, and her small bag felt heavier with every passing moment. She sought shelter in an abandoned bus stop, curling up on the cold, hard bench. Her hands instinctively went to her stomach, where a tiny life was growing inside her. "I will protect you," she whispered to her unborn child, though she was unsure how she would manage even one more night on her own. The rain did not let up, and the cold seeped into her bones. Hours passed in a blur of misery. She was too exhausted to cry anymore and too scared to sleep. She thought of her parents, of her old room with its pale yellow walls and soft quilt. She thought of her friends at school, none of whom would understand what had happened. Most of all, she thought of the tiny life inside her, the reason she was in this mess, but also the only thing keeping her from giving up. As the night stretched on, Grace's shivering became uncontrollable. Her teeth chattered, and her head felt light, almost detached from her body. Just as she began to drift into an uneasy, feverish sleep, she felt a presence nearby. "Child, what are you doing out here in this weather?" a voice asked, warm and full of concern. Grace blinked up at the figure, her vision blurred by rain and exhaustion. An older woman with kind eyes and a large umbrella stood over her. She wore a simple coat and carried a bag that smelled faintly of bread. I have nowhere to go," Grace stammered, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman knelt down, her face softening as she took in Grace's soaked, trembling form. "Come with me, dear. You cannot stay out here," she said gently, holding out her hand. Grace hesitated. Kindness from strangers was a rare thing in Havenbrook, but the warmth in the woman's eyes made her trust her, even though she barely had the strength to move. "My name is Eleanor," the woman said as she helped Grace to her feet. "Let us get you somewhere warm." Eleanor led Grace to a small bakery on the corner of Main Street. It was a modest building, its sign faded, and its windows fogged with condensation. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant, filled with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and cinnamon. Eleanor guided Grace to a chair near the counter and handed her a thick blanket. "Sit here. I will get you something hot to drink," Eleanor said, bustling about the kitchen. Grace wrapped the blanket around herself, her teeth still chattering. The warmth of the bakery was almost overwhelming after hours in the cold, and she felt tears welling up again. But this time, they were tears of relief. Eleanor returned with a steaming cup of tea and a plate of warm bread. "Eat, dear. You need your strength," she said, her voice kind but firm. Grace took a tentative sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through her like a balm. She nibbled on the bread, her hunger outweighing the lump in her throat. Eleanor watched her quietly, her brow furrowed in concern. "Do you have family nearby?" Eleanor asked gently. Grace shook her head. They do not want me," she admitted, her voice breaking. Eleanor's eyes softened further. She reached across the table and placed a hand on Grace's. "You are safe here," she said simply, "for as long as you need." Those words broke something in Grace. She began to sob, the sound raw and filled with all the pain she had been holding in. Eleanor did not say anything, simply letting Grace cry until the storm inside her had quieted. That night, Grace slept on an old cot in the back of the bakery, wrapped in warm blankets. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt safe. The world outside still loomed large and unforgiving, but for now, she had found a small island of kindness in the storm. As she drifted off to sleep, her hands resting on her stomach, Grace whispered to her unborn child, "We will be okay. We have to be." The first rays of dawn filtered through the bakery's fogged windows, casting a soft golden light over the rows of flour-dusted countertops and neatly stacked trays. Grace stirred under the warm quilt Eleanor had given her. For a moment, she felt disoriented, unsure where she was. Then, the events of the previous night rushed back, and her chest tightened. She glanced around the small room at the back of the bakery. It was modest but clean, with shelves lined with jars of spices and dried herbs. A faint warmth emanated from the nearby oven, and the scent of cinnamon lingered in the air. It was a stark contrast to the cold, wet streets she had wandered just hours ago. "You are awake," Eleanor said as she appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with a glass of milk and a plate of freshly baked rolls. She set it on the small table near Grace's cot. "How are you feeling?" Grace sat up slowly, clutching the quilt around her shoulders. "Better," she replied softly, though her voice still trembled with lingering uncertainty. Eleanor gave her a reassuring smile. "Good. You must eat. It is important to keep your strength up, especially now." Grace hesitated, her hands hovering over the food. I do not want to be a burden," she murmured, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Eleanor knelt beside her, her gaze firm, but kind. "You are not a burden, Grace. You are a young girl who needs help, and there is no shame in accepting kindness when it is offered." Tears pricked Grace's eyes, and she nodded, picking up a roll. The warmth of the bread spread through her fingers, grounding her in a way she had not felt in days. She took a bite, the buttery, sweet flavor filling her mouth. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to savor the small comfort. As Grace ate, Eleanor busied herself with the morning's preparations. She moved with practiced ease, kneading dough, measuring ingredients, and tending to the ovens. The rhythm of her movements was almost hypnotic, and Grace found herself watching in quiet fascination. "You are welcome to stay here as long as you need," Eleanor said without looking up from her work. "There is plenty to do, and if you are willing, you can help out around the bakery. It will give you something to focus on." Grace nodded slowly, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of what Eleanor had done for her. By mid-morning, the bakery had come alive with the bustle of customers. The bell above the door chimed constantly as people filed in, their conversations blending with the sounds of clinking coins and the occasional laughter. Grace stayed in the back, helping Eleanor roll out dough and prepare pastries. She found the work soothing, her hands busy, while her mind settled into the rhythm of the task. But even in this small haven, the outside world crept in. As the day wore on, Grace overheard snippets of whispered conversations from the front of the shop. "Is that the girl?" a woman asked, her voice low but audible enough to carry. "Yes, poor Eleanor, taking in someone like that," another replied, her tone dripping with judgment. Grace froze, her hands stilling on the rolling pin. Her stomach knotted, and a familiar wave of shame washed over her. She glanced at Eleanor, who was busy chatting with a customer. If she had heard the comments, she gave no indication. "Do not let it get to you," Eleanor said later, when they were alone in the back. Grace had not mentioned the whispers, but Eleanor seemed to sense her unease. "People will always talk, especially in a town like this. What matters is how you choose to respond." Grace nodded, though the words felt easier said than lived. She admired Eleanor's strength and calmness, traits she desperately wished she could emulate. That evening, after the bakery closed, Grace helped Eleanor clean up. As they swept the floor and wiped down the counters, Eleanor told Grace about her late husband, who had built the bakery with his own hands. "This place has seen its share of struggles," she said, her voice tinged with both sorrow and pride. "But it has also been a source of joy and community. Sometimes, all you need is a little kindness to get through the hard times." Eleanor's words lingered with Grace long after she had gone to bed. As she lay under the quilt, her hands resting on her growing belly, she thought about the unexpected kindness she had been shown. For the first time since being cast out of her home, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she could build a life for herself and her child. The next morning, Grace woke early, determined to prove herself useful. She joined Eleanor in the kitchen, carefully following her instructions and learning the art of baking. As the days turned into weeks, Grace became more confident in her abilities. She took pride in seeing trays of golden pastries emerge from the oven, knowing she had played a part in their creation. The routine brought her a sense of stability, but it also brought challenges. The whispers from customers persisted, and Grace often felt their judgmental stares. One afternoon, as she carried a tray of bread to the front counter, a middle-aged man stopped her. His expression was a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Are you the girl staying with Eleanor?" he asked bluntly. Grace hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "Yes, I am," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded slowly, his gaze lingering for a moment before he handed her a few coins for the bread. He said nothing else, but the weight of his silent judgment pressed heavily on her as she returned to the kitchen. Eleanor noticed her distress and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Remember, Grace, their opinions do not define you. You are stronger than you realize." Grace clung to those words, repeating them to herself whenever doubt or fear threatened to consume her. Slowly but surely, she began to believe them. She found herself standing a little taller, her voice a little steadier, as she faced each new day. One evening, as they closed up the bakery, Eleanor handed Grace a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," she said with a smile. Grace opened it to find a simple notebook and a pen. "To write your thoughts," Eleanor explained. "Sometimes putting your feelings on paper can help lighten the burden." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she hugged Eleanor tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, overwhelmed once again by the older woman's kindness. In the weeks that followed, Grace began using the notebook to chronicle her journey. She wrote about her fears, her dreams, and the small victories she found in her daily life. The act of writing became a source of strength, a way to reclaim her voice and her sense of self. Though the road ahead was still uncertain, Grace felt a spark of hope igniting within her. With Eleanor's unwavering support, she began to believe that she could face whatever challenges came her way. The bakery had become Grace's refuge, a place where the hum of ovens and the comforting scent of bread lulled her anxieties into a dull ache instead of a piercing pain. Yet, as the weeks passed, she couldn't ignore the undercurrent of judgment that flowed through Havenbrook. It wasn't just the whispers at the bakery's front counter. It was the glances in the market, the barely concealed smirks from passing neighbors, and the pitying shakes of heads from the older women who loitered outside the church. Grace tried to focus on her work. She learned to shape dough with precision, to measure flour without spilling a grain, and to create pastries that glistened with golden crusts. Eleanor praised her progress, often patting her shoulder and saying, "You are doing wonderfully, Grace. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." But even Eleanor's encouragement couldn't shield her from the reality outside the bakery walls. One afternoon, as Grace carried a basket of freshly baked loaves to a local grocer, she heard a sharp voice behind her. "Still walking around like nothing happened, huh?" Grace froze, clutching the basket tighter. She turned to see a group of 3 teenage girls standing near the grocer's entrance. Their faces were familiar. She had seen them in church, their polished appearances contrasting starkly with her worn clothes. "Ignore them," Grace whispered to herself, willing her feet to move. But the tallest girl, a blonde with a sharp jawline, stepped into her path. "Do you even know what people are saying about you?" the girl sneered, her arms crossed. "Eleanor must be crazy to take you in. If I were her, I wouldn't risk my business for someone like you." Grace's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "I am just delivering bread," she said quietly, sidestepping the girl. "Delivering bread. More like delivering trouble," another girl muttered, and they all burst into laughter. Grace's cheeks burned as she hurried into the store, her hands shaking as she handed the basket to the grocer. She didn't wait for a receipt or even her payment. She just wanted to escape. Once outside, she ducked into an alley, her back pressed against the cold brick wall as she fought to steady her breathing. "Why do they hate me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her hands instinctively went to her stomach, a habit she'd developed to remind herself of the one thing she was living for. When she returned to the bakery, Eleanor noticed immediately that something was wrong. Grace's pale face and downcast eyes told a story she didn't need to ask about. "What happened, dear?" Eleanor asked gently, as Grace sank into a chair. "Nothing," Grace replied, but her voice cracked, betraying her. She stared at her hands, twisting them nervously. I do not belong here. I am ruining everything for you." Eleanor sat across from her, her hands clasping Grace's firmly. "That is nonsense. You are not ruining anything, Grace. This town can be cruel, yes, but that does not mean you have to carry their cruelty inside you." "But they are right," Grace said, her voice rising in frustration. "I am nothing but trouble. They hate me for what I did, for what I am." Eleanor's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "Listen to me, Grace. People will always find reasons to judge others. It is easier for them to point fingers than to look in the mirror. But you are more than their words. You are strong, and you are brave. Do not let their ignorance define you. Grace wanted to believe Eleanor, but the words of those girls clung to her like thorns. She excused herself, retreating to the small room at the back of the bakery where she could be alone. She opened the notebook Eleanor had given her and began to write. I do not know how to keep going. I am tired of the stares, the whispers, and the way people look at me like I am a mistake. But I have to keep going for you, my little one. You are my reason now. The act of writing calmed her, even as tears blurred the ink. When she finished, she closed the notebook and sat in silence, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. The next day, Grace was determined to prove herself, if not to the town, then to herself. She woke early and joined Eleanor in the kitchen, working tirelessly to prepare the day's orders. As customers came and went, she stayed in the back, avoiding the front counter where the whispers lived. But even in her sanctuary, the outside world found her. Late in the afternoon, Nathan Price and two of his friends entered the bakery. Grace heard their voices before she saw them, their laughter loud and coarse. "Where's your little helper, Eleanor?" Nathan called out, his tone mocking. "Heard she has been causing quite the stir around town." Grace froze, her heart racing. She didn't have to see his face to know the kind of trouble he brought. Eleanor's voice was calm but firm as she replied, "Nathan, if you are here to buy something, then buy it. If not, you can leave." Nathan chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Just wanted to see the girl everyone is talking about. What's her name again? Grace, right?" Grace pressed herself against the wall, willing herself to disappear. Eleanor stepped closer to the counter, her posture unyielding. "Leave her alone, Nathan. She has done nothing to you." "But she's done plenty to this town, hasn't she?" Nathan said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet she thinks she can just hide back there and pretend everything is fine." Before Grace could think, Eleanor's voice rang out, sharp and unyielding. "Nathan Price, you will not speak about her like that. Now get out of my bakery before I call your father and tell him what you have been up to." There was a tense silence, and then Nathan muttered something under his breath before shoving the door open and leaving with his friends. The bell above the door jingled violently in their wake. Grace peeked out from the kitchen, her face pale. "I am so sorry, Eleanor," she said, her voice breaking. "I did not mean to cause trouble." Eleanor crossed the room and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do not apologize, Grace. You are not the one causing trouble. They are, and I will not stand for it." Grace felt a surge of gratitude, and something else, a flicker of courage. Eleanor's unwavering defense of her was like a shield against the cruelty of the town. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt a small spark of hope. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. Maybe kindness, however rare, was enough to keep going. The bakery doors rattled as Eleanor secured the latch for the evening. The commotion earlier with Nathan Price still lingered in Grace's mind, but Eleanor's calm presence reassured her. As the older woman cleaned the counters, she glanced at Grace, who was sitting by the window, her hands folded in her lap. "You did well today," Eleanor said softly, breaking the silence. Grace looked up, startled. "But I did not do anything." "You stayed," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "That is something." The words settled over Grace like a warm blanket. She had spent so much time running from her fears, her past, and the judgment of others, that simply staying in one place felt foreign. Yet here, in this modest bakery, she had found a flicker of peace. The next morning, Grace woke early to the sound of birds chirping outside her small window. She pulled on the apron Eleanor had given her, determined to make herself useful. The routine of the bakery had become her anchor, giving her day's structure and purpose. She found solace in the rhythm of kneading dough, measuring ingredients, and arranging trays of pastries. But today was different. Eleanor had decided they would try something new, a small display table near the counter, showcasing cookies and cakes decorated with intricate patterns. It was Grace's idea, born out of her late-night doodles in the notebook Eleanor had given her. "You have a talent for detail," Eleanor had said when Grace showed her the sketches. "Let us see how they turn out." As Grace carefully piped frosting onto the cookies, her hands trembled with both excitement and nerves. Eleanor worked beside her, offering gentle encouragement. By the time they arranged the finished treats on the display table, Grace felt a small sense of pride bubbling inside her. The bakery opened, and the morning rush began. Regular customers filed in, chatting with Eleanor and purchasing their usual orders. Grace stayed near the back, peeking out occasionally to watch the reactions to her creations. "Did you see these cookies?" a young woman exclaimed, picking up one of Grace's delicately frosted designs. "They are beautiful!" Grace's cheeks flushed with warmth as she overheard the compliments. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she had contributed something meaningful. The cookies sold out quickly, and by midday, Eleanor had to turn customers away, promising more the next day. As they prepared a new batch that afternoon, Eleanor looked at Grace with a twinkle in her eye. "You see? Your ideas have value, Grace. Do not ever doubt that." Grace nodded, though she still struggled to fully believe it. The whispers and stares from the town had etched deep insecurities into her, but Eleanor's words planted a seed of confidence that she hoped would grow with time. However, the judgment from Havenbrook did not vanish overnight. Later that week, as Grace ran an errand to restock supplies, she encountered Evelyn Carter, her estranged mother, at the market. The sight of her mother, with her meticulously styled hair and sharp gaze, stopped Grace in her tracks. "Grace," Evelyn said, her voice a mixture of surprise and something colder. "You look, well." Grace's heart pounded as she searched her mother's face for any sign of warmth. "Hello, Mother," she said quietly, her hands clutching the paper bag of flour. Evelyn's eyes flicked to Grace's rounded belly, and her lips tightened. "I see you are still at that bakery," she said. "I suppose Eleanor is willing to overlook your situation." Grace's stomach churned at her mother's tone. She wanted to shout, to demand why Evelyn had never reached out, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she nodded and murmured, "Eleanor has been kind to me." Evelyn's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained distant. "Kindness is a rare thing. Do not take it for granted," she said, before turning and walking away. Grace stood frozen, her mind swirling with emotions she could not untangle. The encounter left her shaken, but it also solidified her gratitude for Eleanor. Where her own family had turned away, Eleanor had opened her heart and home without hesitation. That evening, Grace confided in Eleanor about the encounter with her mother. They sat at the small kitchen table, a pot of tea between them. "I thought seeing her again would make me feel better," Grace said, staring into her cup, "but it only reminded me of how much I have lost." Eleanor reached across the table and took Grace's hand. "You have lost, yes, but you have also gained. Look at what you are building here, Grace. It may not seem like much now, but it is the foundation of something stronger than what you left behind." Grace nodded, though her heart still ached. She wanted to believe Eleanor, to trust that this small bakery and the kindness within it were enough to rebuild her life. The next day, Eleanor surprised Grace with a small project. "You have been working hard," she said, handing Grace a small, well-worn recipe book. "Why not try creating something entirely your own?" Grace's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. "But what if it does not turn out well?" "Then we try again," Eleanor said with a smile. "Failure is just another step toward success." Encouraged, Grace spent the afternoon experimenting. She combined flavors she remembered from her childhood: cinnamon, nutmeg, and a hint of orange zest. The result was a batch of soft, spiced cookies that filled the bakery with an irresistible aroma. When the first customer bit into one, their eyes lit up. "This is amazing," they said, immediately purchasing more. Grace's heart swelled with pride. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope, a future where she was more than the whispers that followed her. That evening, as Grace tidied the kitchen, Eleanor watched her with a proud smile. "You are finding your place, Grace," she said, "and I think the world is beginning to see what I have seen all along." Grace looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything." Eleanor shook her head. "No thanks are needed, dear. You have always had the strength. I just helped you see it." As Grace lay in bed that night, she placed her hands on her growing belly and whispered to her unborn child, "We are going to be okay. I promise." Though the road ahead was still uncertain, Grace felt the spark of hope growing brighter. With Eleanor by her side, she believed she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg lingered in the air as Grace prepared a new batch of spiced cookies. The bakery had been bustling since her creations had become a favorite among the regulars, and Eleanor couldn't hide her pride whenever someone asked, "Are these Grace's cookies?" But despite the small victories, Grace couldn't shake the encounter with her mother. Evelyn's sharp gaze and curt words replayed in her mind, mingling with memories of her father's anger the night he had sent her away. The weight of those moments pressed heavily on her chest, and no amount of kneading dough seemed to lessen it. Eleanor noticed the change in Grace's demeanor. The girl, who had begun to find her voice, now moved about the bakery with a quieter, more subdued energy. "Grace," Eleanor said one afternoon as they sat in the kitchen for a rare moment of rest, "what is troubling you?" Grace hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "It is my mother," she admitted finally. "Seeing her again brought back everything. The way they looked at me, the way they made me feel like I was nothing." Eleanor nodded, her gaze steady. "Pain from the past has a way of lingering, even when we think we have left it behind. But you are not nothing, Grace. You are a young woman who has faced more than most people ever will, and you are still standing." Grace's eyes filled with tears. But what if she is right? What if I am just trouble? What if— "No!" Eleanor interrupted firmly. "You are not defined by their words or their actions. You are defined by what you choose to do now, and you have already shown incredible strength and resilience." Grace looked down at her hands, which bore small burns and calluses from her work in the bakery. "I want to believe that," she whispered, "but it is hard." Eleanor reached across the table, her hand covering Grace's. "Then let me believe it for you, until you can believe it yourself." The next day, Eleanor surprised Grace with a story she had never shared before. As they worked side by side in the kitchen, Eleanor spoke about her late husband, Arthur, and the struggles they had faced together. "When Arthur and I first opened this bakery, we had nothing," Eleanor began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "We borrowed money, worked long hours, and faced plenty of setbacks. There were days when I thought we had made a mistake, that we would never make it. But Arthur always said, 'Eleanor, it is not about how many times we fall, it is about how many times we get back up.'" Grace listened intently, the rhythm of Eleanor's words mirroring the steady movements of their hands as they shaped dough. "We lost the bakery once, you know," Eleanor continued. "A fire destroyed everything, but we rebuilt. And when Arthur passed, I kept going, even though it felt impossible at times. This bakery is not just a place to make bread. It is a testament to the strength we found in each other and in ourselves." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. Eleanor's story reminded her that hardship didn't have to be the end. It could be the beginning of something new, something stronger. "You have your own strength, Grace," Eleanor said, meeting her gaze. "It is in the way you care for your child, even now. It is in the way you face the world, despite its cruelty. Never forget that." Later that evening, as Grace wrote in her notebook, she found herself reflecting on Eleanor's words. I am trying to find that strength, Eleanor, she wrote. But sometimes, it feels like the past has chained me to a version of myself that I do not want to be. I want to be strong for my child. I want to prove that I am more than what they think I am. As days turned into weeks, Grace began to push herself further. She took on more responsibilities at the bakery, even venturing to the front counter to interact with customers. Some greeted her warmly, while others avoided her gaze or muttered under their breath. But Grace focused on the positive, drawing strength from the few kind words she received. One afternoon, as she arranged a tray of cookies, the doorbell chimed. Grace looked up to see Julia Harper, one of Eleanor's oldest friends, entering the bakery. Julia was a lively woman with bright eyes and a cheerful demeanor that lit up the room. "Well, look at this place," Julia exclaimed, taking in the bustling atmosphere. "You two have really turned it into something special." Eleanor beamed. "We have had a little help," she said, gesturing to Grace. Julia turned to Grace, her smile warm. "So, you are the one Eleanor has been telling me about. It is a pleasure to meet you, Grace." Grace blushed, mumbling a polite response. Julia's genuine kindness took her by surprise. The woman stayed for a while, chatting with Eleanor and occasionally including Grace in the conversation. By the time she left, Grace felt a little lighter, as if the weight of the whispers had eased just a bit. That night, Grace shared a quiet dinner with Eleanor. They sat by the window, the soft glow of the street lamp outside casting shadows on the walls. Grace spoke about her fears and dreams, and Eleanor listened with the patience and wisdom of someone who had weathered her own storms. "You are building a life, Grace," Eleanor said, as they finished their meal. "One step at a time, and you are not doing it alone." Grace smiled faintly, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything." Eleanor shook her head. "No thanks are needed. We are family now, Grace. And family supports each other, no matter what." As Grace prepared for bed that night, she felt a small spark of hope igniting within her. The weight of the past was still there, but it felt a little less heavy. With Eleanor by her side and the bakery as her anchor, Grace began to believe that she could move forward. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered to her unborn child, "We will keep going, little one." Together, the morning light streamed through the bakery windows, casting a warm glow over the busy kitchen. Grace hummed softly as she shaped dough for the day's bread. The rhythm of the work had become her solace, a steady beat that drowned out the noise of judgment from the world outside. Eleanor entered, carrying a basket of fresh fruit from the market. Her cheerful demeanor was a balm to Grace's lingering doubts. "I have an idea for a new tart recipe," Eleanor announced. "Something bright and sweet, just like you." Grace laughed softly, shaking her head. "I do not think anyone would call me that, Eleanor." "Well, they should," Eleanor replied, placing the basket on the counter. "Now let us get to work." The two of them spent the morning experimenting with the new recipe, their laughter filling the small kitchen. For a few hours, Grace almost forgot about the whispers and stares that awaited her whenever she stepped outside. The peace was short-lived. As Grace stepped out to take out the trash that afternoon, she noticed a group of young men loitering near the corner of the street. Among them was Nathan Price. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes gleamed with mischief as they locked onto Grace. "Well, if it isn't the bakery's little charity case," Nathan called out, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a few passers-by. Grace froze, her pulse quickening. She clutched the bag of trash tightly, willing herself to ignore him. "Hey, I am talking to you," Nathan shouted, stepping closer. His friends snickered, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. "Leave me alone," Grace said, her voice shaking, but firm. She turned to head back inside, but Nathan blocked her path. "What are you going to do? Hide behind Eleanor like you always do," he taunted. "You think you are better than us just because she took pity on you?" Grace's heart pounded as she tried to sidestep him, but Nathan grabbed her arm, stopping her in her tracks. "Let me go," she demanded, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "Or what?" Nathan sneered, leaning closer. Before Grace could respond, Eleanor's voice rang out like a crack of thunder. "Nathan Price, you let her go this instant!" Nathan released Grace's arm, startled by Eleanor's commanding tone. The older woman stood in the bakery doorway, her hands on her hips and her gaze fierce. "This is my bakery, and I will not tolerate you harassing anyone who works here," Eleanor said, her voice steady and unwavering. "If you or your friends so much as step foot near here again, I will be having a word with your father." Nathan glared at Eleanor, his bravado faltering under her steely gaze. "Fine," he muttered, stepping back. "But this is not over." He turned and walked away, his friends following reluctantly. Grace stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Eleanor rushed to her side, gently guiding her back into the bakery. Inside, Eleanor sat Grace down and handed her a glass of water. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Grace nodded, though her hands trembled as she held the glass. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I did not mean to cause trouble." "Grace, listen to me," Eleanor said, crouching beside her. "You are not the one causing trouble. Nathan and his friends are. Do not ever blame yourself for their cruelty." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Eleanor placed a comforting hand on Grace's knee. "You are strong, Grace. Stronger than you realize. Do not let people like Nathan make you forget that." That evening, as the bakery closed, Grace helped Eleanor clean up in silence. Her mind replayed the events of the day, her emotions swirling between anger, fear, and shame. She hated that she had let Nathan's words affect her so deeply, but the weight of them felt impossible to shake. "Eleanor," Grace said hesitantly as they locked up for the night, Do you think I will ever escape this?" Eleanor looked at her, her expression softening. "The whispers and the judgment? Maybe not entirely, but you do not have to let them define you. You are building something here, Grace, something they cannot take away." Grace nodded, though her heart still ached. She wanted to believe Eleanor, to trust that the bakery and the kindness they had found within it could withstand the cruelty of the world outside. The next morning, Grace woke early to find Eleanor already in the kitchen, a determined look on her face. "Today, we focus on the good," Eleanor said, handing Grace an apron. "We will not let yesterday's shadows darken today's light." Grace smiled faintly and joined Eleanor at the counter. Together, they prepared for the day, their movements steady and purposeful. By the time the bakery opened, Grace felt a small spark of hope rekindling in her chest. But that hope was tested once more when they discovered the bakery's windows had been defaced with crude graffiti. The words were harsh and hateful, their meaning clear. Grace was not welcome in Havenbrook. Eleanor's face darkened as she read the words, but she quickly turned to Grace, her expression softening. "Do not let this break you," she said firmly. "We will clean it up, and we will keep going." Grace nodded, though tears burned in her eyes. Together, they scrubbed the windows, their determination stronger than the hateful words. That afternoon, as Grace worked in the kitchen, a woman entered the bakery. She was older, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I heard about what happened," the woman said to Eleanor. "I wanted to offer my support." Eleanor smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Julia. Your kindness means more than you know." Julia looked at Grace, her expression gentle. "You are doing good work here, young lady. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Grace's throat tightened, but she managed a small smile. "Thank you," she whispered. As Julia left, Grace felt a flicker of hope reignite within her. For every Nathan, there was a Julia, someone who saw her not for her past, but for the person she was trying to become. That evening, as Grace lay in bed, she placed her hands on her growing belly and whispered, "We will keep going, little one, no matter what." The weight of the world still pressed heavily on her, but with Eleanor by her side and moments of unexpected kindness lighting the way, Grace began to believe she could face whatever came next. The bakery bustled with activity as Grace and Eleanor prepared for the day. The new tart recipe had become a customer favorite, and Grace had taken pride in mastering the delicate balance of flavors. Each creation felt like a small victory, a step toward proving her worth to the town and herself. Eleanor noticed Grace's growing confidence and smiled quietly to herself. Despite the challenges, Grace was blossoming. Yet Eleanor knew that the wounds from Grace's past still lingered, raw and unresolved. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the bakery in soft amber light, the bell above the door chimed. Grace looked up from the counter, her breath catching in her throat. Evelyn Carter stood in the doorway, her figure outlined by the setting sun. She looked older than Grace remembered, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into a tight bun, and her shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. "Grace," Evelyn said softly, her voice hesitant. The air in the bakery seemed to thicken. Grace's heart raced as a swirl of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion rose within her. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "What are you doing here?" Grace asked, her voice trembling but firm. Eleanor, who had been arranging pastries near the back, stepped forward cautiously. "Grace," she said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder, "perhaps you should hear her out." Grace shook her head, her eyes locked on Evelyn. "Why now? After all this time? Why are you here?" Evelyn took a step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I had to see you. I had to try." "Try what?" Grace shot back, her tone sharp. "To make yourself feel better? To ease your guilt?" Eleanor squeezed Grace's shoulder. "Grace, take a breath. Let her speak." Grace hesitated, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had flared. She gestured toward one of the tables. "Fine. Say what you need to say." Evelyn sat down slowly, her movements careful, as though afraid she might shatter the fragile moment. "I have thought about you every day since you left," she began. "Your father, he struggled with what happened. He was proud and stubborn, and he never admitted his regret. But I saw it in him, and I was no better." Grace's hands tightened into fists at her sides. "You turned your back on me," she said, her voice breaking. "You threw me out like I was nothing." Tears glistened in Evelyn's eyes as she nodded. "I know, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. I was scared, Grace. Scared of what people would say. Scared of what it would mean for our family. But none of that mattered. I see that now. I failed you when you needed me most." Grace looked away, her chest tight. The pain of her mother's betrayal was a wound that had never fully healed. She had spent years trying to forget, but seeing Evelyn now brought it all rushing back. "I do not know if I can forgive you," Grace said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn nodded, her tears spilling over. "I do not expect you to. But please, let me try to make things right. Let me get to know you again, and—" Her voice faltered as her eyes flicked to Grace's growing belly. "Let me meet my grandchild." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken for too long. Grace felt Eleanor's hand on her back, steady and reassuring. "You do not have to decide now," Eleanor said gently. "Take your time." Grace nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She turned away, retreating to the kitchen to gather her thoughts. The sight of her mother, broken and remorseful, had stirred something deep within her, a flicker of longing she couldn't suppress, no matter how much she tried. The next day, Evelyn returned to the bakery. This time, she came bearing a small basket of freshly picked apples. She approached the counter hesitantly, her hands trembling as she set the basket down. "I thought you could use these for your tarts," she said, her voice tentative. Grace glanced at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. Reluctantly, Grace accepted the basket. "Thank you," she said stiffly. Evelyn stayed for a while, sitting at a corner table and quietly observing as Grace and Eleanor worked. She didn't push or pry, respecting the unspoken boundaries Grace had set. For Grace, the presence of her mother was both a comfort and a challenge, a reminder of the pain she had endured, but also a glimmer of what could be rebuilt. Over the following weeks, Evelyn became a regular visitor to the bakery. She helped with small tasks, peeling apples or arranging displays, always careful to let Grace set the pace. Slowly, tentatively, they began to talk not about the past, but about the present. Evelyn asked about the recipes Grace was working on, and Grace found herself answering, her initial hostility softening with time. Eleanor watched their interactions with quiet satisfaction. She saw the walls Grace had built around her heart begin to crack, allowing the possibility of forgiveness to seep in. One evening, as the sun set over Havenbrook, Grace and Evelyn sat together at one of the bakery's small tables. Eleanor had retired early, leaving the two of them alone. "Why now?" Grace asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Why did you come back?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Because I could not bear to lose you forever," she said simply. "Your father's pride kept him from reaching out, and I let my fear do the same. But when he passed, I realized that I could not let fear dictate my life anymore. I had to try, even if it was too late." Grace's throat tightened, but she nodded. "It hurt, you know, what you and Dad did. It broke me." Evelyn reached across the table, her hand trembling as it covered Grace's. "I know, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." The sincerity in her mother's voice stirred something in Grace, a fragile, tentative hope. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of healing. "We will see," Grace said quietly, her voice steady but cautious. "We will see." That night, as Grace lay in bed, she placed her hands on her belly and whispered, "We might have more family than I thought, little one." For the first time in years, the weight of the past felt a little lighter, and the possibility of a brighter future began to take shape. The morning sun bathed the bakery in golden light as Grace kneaded dough at the counter. Eleanor was humming softly nearby, slicing apples for another batch of tarts. The rhythm of the day's work was soothing, but Grace couldn't ignore the flutter of nervous energy in her chest. Evelyn had promised to return that afternoon, and though their tentative truce seemed to hold, the thought of spending more time with her mother filled Grace with conflicting emotions. Would today bring another step toward understanding, or would the past rear its ugly head once more? Grace wasn't sure, but a part of her, a part she hadn't fully admitted to herself, hoped it would be the former. Evelyn arrived just as the lunch rush began to dwindle. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, their bright colors a cheerful contrast to the tension in the air. "These are for the counter," Evelyn said, her voice light but tinged with nervousness. "I thought they might brighten the place up a bit." Grace hesitated before taking the flowers. "Thank you," she said quietly. She arranged them in a glass jar and placed it by the window, where the sunlight made the petals glow. Eleanor watched the exchange from her spot at the cash register, her heart swelling with hope. She had seen how far Grace had come since arriving at the bakery, and she sensed that this was another step forward, even if it wasn't easy. As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn settled into her usual spot at a corner table, peeling apples and chatting softly with Eleanor. Grace focused on her work, sneaking glances at her mother every now and then. She noticed the lines etched into Evelyn's face, the way her hands trembled slightly as she worked. This wasn't the cold, distant woman who had cast her out. This was someone else, someone trying. "Grace," Evelyn said tentatively, breaking her reverie. "Do you have a moment?" Grace hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron before approaching the table. "What is it?" Evelyn gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit, please. I wanted to ask about the baby." Grace's heart clenched, but she sat down, her hands resting protectively on her belly. "What about her?" she asked, her voice wary. "How are you feeling? Is everything all right?" Evelyn's eyes were filled with genuine concern. Grace nodded slowly. "I am fine." "She is fine," she said. Then, after a pause, she added, "Her name will be Anna." Evelyn's lips trembled into a small smile. "Anna, that is a beautiful name." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy, but not hostile. Grace found herself relaxing, just a little, as Evelyn's questions shifted to lighter topics: how Grace liked working at the bakery, what she thought of the town, and whether she had tried Eleanor's famous cinnamon rolls. As the days turned into weeks, Evelyn's visits became a regular occurrence. She offered to help with small tasks around the bakery, always careful not to overstep. Grace remained guarded, but she couldn't deny that her mother's presence had begun to feel less like an intrusion and more like a quiet reassurance. One afternoon, as they worked together in the kitchen, Evelyn spoke up hesitantly. "Grace, I know I cannot undo the past, but I hope that, with time, I can be part of your future. And Anna's future." Grace paused, her hands stilling over the bowl of dough she was mixing. "It will take time," she said softly, "but I am willing to try." Evelyn nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, Eleanor invited Evelyn to stay for dinner. The three women sat around the small table in the kitchen, sharing a simple meal of soup and bread. The conversation was light, filled with stories from Eleanor's younger days and laughter over her attempts to teach Grace the intricacies of baking. "I remember the first loaf of bread Grace baked," Eleanor said with a chuckle. "It was so dense I thought it might break the counter." Grace rolled her eyes, though a smile tugged at her lips. "I am much better now, thank you very much." Evelyn laughed softly, her gaze lingering on Grace. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of connection with her daughter, a fragile thread that she vowed to nurture. As the weeks went on, the bakery became a hub of quiet healing. Grace and Evelyn began to share more stories from Grace's childhood, memories of her father, and dreams for the future. Evelyn learned about the hardships Grace had faced after being cast out, and each revelation deepened her resolve to make amends. One afternoon, as they prepared a batch of cookies, Evelyn hesitated before speaking. "Grace, I know this might be difficult, but I think it is important to talk about your father." Grace stiffened, her hands pausing over the tray of dough. "What about him?" "He regretted what happened," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "He would never admit it, but I saw it every day. After you left, he would sit by the window for hours, as if hoping you might come back." Grace swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Then why didn't he reach out? Why didn't he try to fix it?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Because he was too proud, too ashamed, and I was too weak to stand up to him. I should have fought for you, Grace. I will carry that regret with me forever." Grace looked away, her emotions churning. "He is gone now. There is nothing I can do about it." "But you can forgive him," Evelyn said softly. "Not for his sake, but for yours. Holding on to that anger will only hurt you, Grace, and you deserve peace." The words stayed with Grace long after Evelyn left that day. She sat by the window of the bakery, staring out at the quiet street, and thought about her father, the man who had cast her out, and the man who had, perhaps, longed for her return. That night, as Grace lay in bed, she whispered to her unborn daughter, "I do not know if I can forgive him, Anna, but I will try, for you and for me." The journey toward healing was far from over, but Grace felt a small weight lift from her chest. With each passing day, the cracks in her heart were slowly mending, piece by piece. The aroma of freshly baked bread and cinnamon filled the bakery as Grace bustled about, arranging pastries in the display case. The small bouquet of wildflowers her mother had brought weeks ago still sat on the counter, though a few petals had begun to wilt. For Grace, they symbolized the tentative truce between her and Evelyn, a fragile bloom that needed care to flourish. Eleanor, ever the pillar of calm encouragement, stood nearby, kneading dough. Her steady rhythm reassured Grace as the day began, but both women sensed an unspoken tension in the air. The whispers around Havenbrook hadn't faded entirely, and the bakery's reputation still bore the brunt of judgment from certain corners of the community. That afternoon, as the sun streamed through the windows, a group of neighborhood women entered the bakery. Grace recognized them immediately, frequent gossips whose judgmental glances she had grown accustomed to. "Good afternoon," Grace said, her voice steady as she forced a polite smile. The women exchanged looks before approaching the counter. One of them, Mrs. Harper, leaned in slightly. "I have to say, Grace, these new recipes of yours are quite the talk of the town," she said, her tone almost begrudgingly complimentary. "Thank you," Grace replied, though her heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, as if waiting for her to falter. Another woman, Mrs. Lane, pursed her lips. "It must be difficult, though, running this bakery with everything going on." Grace's hands tightened on the counter, but before she could respond, Eleanor stepped in. "Grace has been a blessing to this bakery," she said firmly. "Her hard work and creativity have brought us more success than we've seen in years." The women looked momentarily taken aback, and Grace felt a swell of gratitude toward Eleanor. Though the exchange ended civilly, the lingering tension reminded Grace of how deeply judgment ran in Havenbrook. That evening, Grace confided in Eleanor as they cleaned up the bakery. "Sometimes I wonder if they'll ever see me as anything but a mistake," she admitted, her voice heavy with doubt. Eleanor set down the tray she was holding and turned to Grace. "You are not a mistake, Grace. You are a young woman who has faced more challenges than most people could imagine, and you have done so with strength and grace. Do not let their small minds diminish your light." Grace nodded, though the ache in her chest remained. "I just wish I could prove it to them, to everyone." Eleanor's gaze softened. "Then let us prove it together. We'll show them what this bakery and what you are truly capable of." The opportunity came sooner than either of them expected. A week later, Eleanor received a notice from the Havenbrook Community Board. The annual Harvest Festival was approaching, and the bakery had been invited to participate in the town's showcase of local businesses. "This could be our chance," Eleanor said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "If we do well at the festival, it might change how people see us and you." Grace hesitated, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. "What if it backfires? What if they still look at me the same way?" Eleanor placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We cannot control how others see us, Grace, but we can control how we present ourselves. And I believe in you." Buoyed by Eleanor's confidence, Grace threw herself into preparing for the festival. She worked tirelessly alongside Eleanor and even enlisted Evelyn's help. The three women spent long hours in the kitchen, experimenting with new recipes and perfecting old favorites. Evelyn proved to be a steady presence, offering quiet support as she peeled apples and folded dough. The day of the Harvest Festival dawned bright and crisp, the autumn air filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts and spiced cider. Grace and Eleanor arrived early, setting up their booth with care. The display featured an array of breads, tarts, and cookies, each carefully arranged to showcase their craftsmanship. Grace had even crafted small cards with handwritten descriptions of each item, a touch of personal pride. Evelyn arrived shortly after, carrying a thermos of hot tea and a warm smile. "You both have done a wonderful job," she said, her eyes lingering on Grace. "I am so proud of you." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. As the festival began, the streets filled with families, couples, and groups of friends, all eager to sample the town's offerings. At first, the bakery's booth received only a trickle of visitors. Some neighbors stopped by out of curiosity, while others seemed hesitant, their judgmental glances lingering too long. But as the day wore on, word of their baked goods spread. Soon, a line formed, and Grace found herself working alongside Eleanor and Evelyn to keep up with the demand. "These tarts are incredible," a man exclaimed, biting into one of their spiced apple creations. "Did you come up with this recipe yourself?" a woman asked Grace, her tone genuinely curious. Grace nodded, her cheeks flushing with pride. "Yes, I did." The woman smiled warmly. "Well, it's a winner. I'll take 2 more, please." By mid-afternoon, their booth was nearly sold out. Grace could hardly believe it. Their hard work was paying off, and for the first time, she felt truly seen for her efforts, not her past. As the festival wound down, Grace and Eleanor sat together behind the booth, sipping cider and watching the last of the crowds disperse. Evelyn joined them, her face glowing with pride. "You did it," Evelyn said, her voice soft but full of emotion. "You showed them who you really are." Grace looked at her mother, then at Eleanor, and finally at the empty trays that had once been filled with their creations. A sense of accomplishment washed over her, warming her from the inside out. "I couldn't have done it without you both," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for believing in me." Eleanor reached over and squeezed her hand. "You believed in yourself, Grace. That's what matters." That night, as Grace lay in bed, she reflected on the day's events. The whispers and judgment hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had been drowned out by something far more powerful: acceptance and recognition. For the first time, Grace allowed herself to hope that the future could be different, that she could build a life filled with pride, love, and resilience. Placing her hands on her belly, she whispered to Anna, "We are going to be just fine, little one. This is only the beginning." 13 years had passed since that fateful night when Grace was cast out into the cold. The journey from rejection and despair to resilience and hope had not been easy, but it had shaped her into the woman she was today, a mother, a business owner, and a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The smell of coffee and freshly baked pastries filled the air of Anna's cafe, the bustling establishment Grace had built from the ground up. Named after her daughter, the cafe was more than just a business. It was a symbol of perseverance, a sanctuary of warmth and community. Grace stood behind the counter, her hands deftly preparing a latte while greeting customers with a warm smile. Her confidence radiated in her every movement, a stark contrast to the shy, uncertain girl she once was. The walls of the cafe were adorned with photographs of the bakery that had started it all, a tribute to Eleanor, who had passed away peacefully 3 years ago, but whose legacy lived on in every corner of Grace's life. "Mom, table 3 needs more sugar packets," Anna called from across the cafe, balancing a tray of drinks with the ease of someone far beyond her 13 years. Grace chuckled. "On it, sweetheart." Anna was the spitting image of her mother at that age, but with an air of confidence and curiosity that Grace had worked hard to nurture. She was bright, quick-witted, and fiercely independent, a constant reminder of the life Grace had fought to give her. As Grace replenished the sugar packets, she overheard a group of customers at a nearby table. "Did you hear? Grace Miller was just featured in the local paper again. They're calling her an inspiration," one woman said. "She deserves it," another replied. "She turned her life around and built something incredible. This cafe has brought so many people together." The words warmed Grace's heart. She didn't seek recognition, but hearing her story framed in a positive light reminded her of how far she had come. That afternoon, as the cafe buzzed with its usual energy, the doors swung open, and Evelyn entered. Time had softened her once sharp features, and her silver hair framed a face filled with pride. She carried a bouquet of daisies, one of Grace's favorites. "Mom!" Anna exclaimed, rushing over to greet her grandmother. Evelyn's face lit up as she embraced Anna. "Hello, my darling. How's my favorite helper today?" "Busy as ever," Anna said with a grin. "But it's fun. Mom says I might get to manage the cafe one day." Evelyn laughed. "I have no doubt you'll do a wonderful job." As Evelyn approached the counter, Grace met her with a warm smile. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart," Evelyn said, setting the daisies on the counter. "I thought these might brighten up the cafe." "They're beautiful. Thank you," Grace replied, her voice filled with genuine affection. Their relationship had transformed over the years. What began as a tentative truce had blossomed into a bond built on trust, understanding, and forgiveness. Evelyn had worked tirelessly to make amends, and Grace had opened her heart, allowing the wounds of the past to heal. Later that evening, after the cafe had closed, the three of them sat around a small table, sharing a simple meal. Anna peppered Evelyn with questions about her childhood, laughing at stories Grace had never heard before. "Your mother was always stubborn," Evelyn said with a chuckle. "But that stubbornness is what got her through the toughest times." Grace smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I learned from the best," she said softly, glancing at Evelyn. Evelyn reached over and squeezed Grace's hand. "You've made me so proud, Grace. You've built something extraordinary, not just this cafe, but a life filled with love and hope." After dinner, Grace stood in the quiet cafe, tidying up as Anna worked on her homework at one of the tables. She looked around at the space she had created, a space filled with laughter, warmth, and community. It was a far cry from the lonely streets she had wandered all those years ago. "Mom?" Anna's voice broke through her thoughts. "Yes, sweetheart? Do you ever think about what it was like before, when things were hard?" Grace hesitated, her heart tightening at the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not in a bad way. Those memories remind me of how far we've come and how strong we are." Anna nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad we have this cafe. It feels like home." Grace smiled, her chest swelling with pride. "That's exactly what I wanted it to be for us, and for everyone who walks through those doors." As the evening wore on, Grace found herself reflecting on Eleanor and the role she had played in her journey. The notebook Eleanor had given her all those years ago still sat in her bedside drawer, filled with entries chronicling her struggles, triumphs, and dreams. It was a reminder of the kindness that had saved her life and the strength she had found within herself. Placing her hand over her heart, Grace whispered, "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything." The next morning, as the cafe came alive with its usual hum of activity, Grace welcomed each customer with a smile. Anna worked alongside her, taking orders and chatting with regulars as though she had been doing it her whole life. Evelyn sat near the window sipping tea and watching her daughter and granddaughter with quiet pride. In her heart, Grace knew that life would never be perfect. There would always be challenges and hardships, whispers of judgment from those who clung to the past. But she also knew that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, and she was surrounded by people who loved and believed in her. As the day unfolded, Grace felt a profound sense of gratitude for Eleanor, for Evelyn, for Anna, and for the journey that had brought her here. She had learned that kindness could change lives, that forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds, and that hope could light the way through the darkest of times. And as she stood behind the counter of Anna's cafe, greeting each customer with a smile, Grace knew that her story was far from over. It was a story of resilience, love, and second chances, a story that she would continue to write, one day at a time. Grace's journey reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. Through resilience, kindness, and the strength of the human spirit. She transformed her life and created something beautiful for herself and her daughter. Her story is a testament to the power of second chances, the healing nature of forgiveness, and the courage it takes to rebuild from nothing. If this story inspired you, please give it a like and share it with others who might need a reminder that brighter days are always ahead. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales of perseverance and hope. Your support encourages us to continue sharing stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.